Hey, good afternoon. I guess since it's actually a couple minutes past the noon hour. I'm Rich Sliles. I'm with the Wyoming PTAC, which is the Procurement Technical Assistance Center. And I just want to say welcome to everybody and thank you for joining me today for another 22 at noon session presented by the Greater Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce and the Wyoming PTAC. Today's topic is going to be teaming arrangements and joint venture agreements, and this is a live 22-minute broadcast. Basically, what I'd like to do today is I would like to cover essentially five basic points, five basic areas. I'm going to start off by talking about essentially what teaming and joint ventures are, and then I want to spend a few minutes talking about why companies may want to team up or enter into teaming arrangements and joint ventures. And since there's an awful lot of rules governing this, especially within the realm of federal government contracting, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest one, the 3 and 2 rule, or as sometimes you might hear it called the 3/2 rule. Then from there, I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about affiliation. And how that's not a good thing, and because it really does relate to teaming and joint venture agreements. So you have to always be mindful of the concept, the legal definition of affiliation. And then the fifth thing I'm going to talk about is some other rules for socioeconomic programs. So let's start off with teaming. Generally, teaming is a prime subcontractor relationship. So you have a prime contractor who's receiving a contract from either the federal government or state and local entity, and then you have a series probably of subcontractors underneath that. Basically, in this type of relationship, subcontractors are responsible for the subcontracted work, and the prime is responsible for the project in its entirety. From the standpoint of a subcontractor, teaming arrangement does oftentimes give them limited liability because they're really just liable and just focused in on that one particular area for which they have responsibility in that subcontracting agreement. Now, in this situation, the prime contractor does have control over the teaming and the teaming arrangement, so they're pretty much the ones in the driver's seat. Going and controlling the whole project, generally speaking, because they're managing it. Teaming agreements are usually set up so they can, kind of lock in the parties, the pricing, the scope, just helping to manage the contract essentially in its entirety. Now, from the standpoint of a small business, a subcontractor, assuming the small business is a subcontractor in the relationship, it can be a lot easier for that particular subcontractor, that small business, and basically the reason is that the transactions that you're involved in are going to really mimic more or less the type of transactions that you'd be used to dealing with in the private sector anyway. The invoicing, generally speaking, is going to be a lot simpler. There's going to be a lot less paperwork involved, as compared to if the small business was the one that actually had the prime contract directly with the federal government, or if there's a joint venture arrangement set up, agreement and separate entities set up, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But teaming arrangements, once again, can be a lot easier just for the small business if they're a subcontractor. So anyway, that's teaming. So joint ventures are a little bit different. Joint ventures are separate legal entities that are formed to bid and perform a contract. Unlike the teaming arrangement, the contract is directly between the actual new separate legal entity, the joint venture, and the government. So you have Company A, Company B, they get together, form a joint venture. The prime contract is actually going to be with that joint venture and the federal government. For the most part, they have to be unpopulated starting in August of 2006, at least for federal contracting purposes. And just to back up for a second, joint venture, the companies, the legal entities that are formed, can either be populated or they can be unpopulated. And a populated joint venture is one in which the joint venture itself actually has employees that are on the payroll of that joint venture. Unpopulated actually is where where the joint venture itself doesn't have any employees. Each employee remains an employee of company A or company B. So starting for federal contracting purposes, at least starting in 2016, the joint ventures need to be, for the most part, unpopulated. I'll talk about the exception if we have enough time for that here before I finish up. One of the differences between teaming and a joint venture is that the members of a joint venture are jointly responsible for the contract performance and for the liability of that particular contract jointly and severably. And once again, there are a few exceptions to that, but generally speaking, joint venture members also can be subcontractors on the project. But the one thing to keep in mind is that joint ventures, generally speaking, are neither quick nor easy. But but don't let that be a deterrent for you. Don't let the fact that it takes a little extra work to set up a joint venture and to make it work properly. Don't let that deter you from doing it if it makes sense for you, if it's right for you, because the benefits of doing it and doing it correctly can truly be immense. So basically, why would you want to team up or joint venture? And one of the best reasons is to basically is the purpose that most companies do it is essentially to share resources and responsibilities. So more often than not, a company enters into a joint venture business arrangement because it lacks something. It lacks the required knowledge, the human capital, skill set, technology, or in some cases even access to a specific market. So when you have two businesses coming together, it basically will afford each party access to the resources that the other participating company doesn't have, for example, or that the other company has that the first company doesn't. So so basically, to give you an example, if you've got company A over here and company B, now company B has created a new product. They've got a new product that they want to bring to market. And company A owns facilities for manufacturing and producing, and they've got the manufacturing production technology that company B needs to create and ultimately distribute that new product that they've come out with. So in this case, each one of those companies could form a joint venture, and that joint venture would give company B access to the equipment that company A has without purchasing or leasing it, while company A is able to participate in this whole process in the production, and also company A gets a nice benefit out of it because they probably didn't incur any cost to develop the project, and it's so each company benefits when the joint venture is successful, and really neither one is left to complete the project alone. So with that said, let's see. One of the things that's really nice is another reason why to team up or joint venture is just the flexibility that it allows. One of the other options that these two companies would have, in the example that I gave, would be they could either do a merger or an acquisition, and that's rather permanent. The joint venture is really a temporary contract between the companies, and it exists for the purposes of, it really exists for the purposes of this particular project. So once this project's over, the joint venture, can be over at that time, or it can extend out to other projects if they want it to. But basically, in a nutshell, each company's able to maintain its own identity, and then it can return to its normal business operations once the joint venture or the activity for the joint venture is completed. So another good reason why companies might want a team or joint venture is that it shares the business risk. Under a joint venture, each company is going to contribute a portion of the resources needed to bring the product or the service to market. They're going to be able to pool capital. They're going to be able to pool other resources. So it kind of distributes that risk between the two companies that are doing it, rather than one just having to shoulder all of that risk on its own. So, okay, well that's kind of why to joint venture or team. And let's take a look at one of the rules. And one of the real big rules that's important for this is actually called I call it the 3 and 2 rule. It's referred to a lot of times as the 3 over 2 rule. And basically what it says is that, okay, these two companies have gotten together and they formed this joint venture. And for federal contracting purposes, they may not be awarded more than 3 contracts over a 2-year period. If they are, if they do more than that, and once again there's some exceptions, then they could be deemed affiliated for pretty much all purposes. Now the one thing to keep in mind is that the clock for that 2-year period doesn't start ticking until the joint venture actually receives its first contract. So say they form these two companies form a joint venture the first of this year. Say they formed the joint venture, legally formed it on January 1st, 2018, and they received their first contract October 15th. So that 2-year period would start October 15, 2018, and would end in October of 2020. So there are a couple exceptions to that, and we could spend a whole day talking about the 3 over 2 rule, but there are some exceptions to it. So just keep it in mind. For example, if a company's already been awarded 2 contracts and they've put bids out for maybe 3 more contracts, and they happen to receive 2 out of those 3 contracts they put bids out for, so they wind up with a total of 4 contracts now that they've won. In a scenario like that, then yeah, they could actually have more than 3, but at that point they'd be done. After that, they'd pretty much be considered affiliated. Now, the one thing to also keep in mind too is that this joint venture is a separate legal entity all of its own, and these two companies could actually form more than one joint venture. They could do, not real creative on the fly necessarily with names, but they could have joint venture number 1 and joint venture number 2, and each one of those joint ventures would be able to acquire 3 contracts over their respective 2-year periods, and they could actually run concurrently. So there is some flexibility with this. The one thing to keep in mind is if they start forming a large number of these joint ventures, then they still could become affiliated. So I've been using this term quite a bit, affiliation, and I just want to spend a second talking about that. The affiliated for federal contracting purposes means that the two companies basically, for determining size standards and everything else, whether they're a small business or not, would be all of their resources, everything would be combined. So if their size standard is based on the number of employees, you'd add up the number of employees from both companies. Or if their size standard is based on revenue, which is most construction is based on revenue, average revenue over a 3-year period, you would take the revenue from both company A and company B, add that together, and if it added up to greater than whatever the size standard was, then neither company, unfortunately, would be considered to be small for federal contracting purposes, even if individually they were still small on their own. So the one thing I'll say about affiliation is if you could find a way to spell affiliation with just 4 letters, it would really, in the world of government contracting, it really would be the quintessential 4-letter word. In that it's a really, really bad thing for a small business. And let me give you an exact example with some numbers. Most specialty trade contracting companies, the size standard is $15 million per year, averaged over a 3-year period. So let's take company A, and it has $6 million in revenue averaged over the past 3 years, and you have company B that has $10 million in revenue averaged over the past 3 years. Well, individually and separately, they're both small businesses. But if they were to somehow become affiliated under the affiliation rules for federal contracting, it means you'd have to add those two together, and 10 plus 6 is 16 million, the size standard being 15 million in this particular example. They would no longer qualify as small businesses. And that's really bad, because if they, no longer would they have the small business be able to participate in the small business set aside, but if they had any of the socioeconomic designations, and there are 6 of them, it could be woman-owned, economically disadvantaged, woman-owned small business, veteran-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, 8A, the number 8, letter A, or hub zone. That any of those designations, one of the criteria for all of those is that a business has to be a small business. And if they lose that small business designation, then the socioeconomic designations they have along with it are also going to go by the wayside. So affiliation is a very, very awful thing for small businesses. So the whole reason you do a joint venture basically is that you comply with the rules of the joint venture, and you make sure you comply with the rules and stay away from affiliation. So you join this joint venture so you will not become affiliated, in a nutshell. So some of the rules for socioeconomic programs, looks like I've got about 5 more minutes here. I'd like to take a second and just talk about some of the rules for the socioeconomic programs that I was just describing, and just keep in mind there are certain rules for forming joint ventures if you have socioeconomic designations like woman-owned small business or veteran-owned small business or hub zone. And the one I'd like to talk a little bit about is hub zone. And let me stop here before I even really get into the rules and all that. You might ask, well, why would these two businesses specifically want to form joint ventures? And the reason is, let's say you've got two businesses, and one is let's say one has service-disabled veteran-owned small business certification, which also means they have veteran-owned small business certification. And maybe they're an 8A company, and that we'll call that company A. And then we have company B over here, and they have economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business certification, which also includes woman-owned, which means they have woman-owned too. And then maybe they have hub zone certification. Well, they could form a couple of different joint ventures. These two companies come together and they form two separate joint ventures, one that company A controls and one that company B controls. And so therefore they would cover the entire spectrum of the socioeconomic set-asides for the federal government, and also for the socioeconomic set-asides that the large prime contractors have that have large prime contracts for the federal government. So what it would allow each one of these businesses to do is, through their joint ventures, they would be able to bid on any single one of the 6 possible set-asides that the federal government could issue a solicitation under. So it would have its advantages that way. And even though they wouldn't be the company that was doing the entire work, they would still share in a portion of it. So it could be very advantageous for them from that standpoint. So anyway, so with a little bit of time, a couple of minutes we have left real quickly, I just want to talk about some of the rules that you'd have, for example, with hub zone. And once again, we could talk about the rules of joint ventures for socioeconomic programs. We could literally spend a week on it. But basically, just to throw out some stuff, just so you're familiar with it. The joint venture agreement has to be set in writing, and it has to state the purpose of the joint venture. The managing venture, the joint venture agreement has to designate the hub zone small business as the managing entity for the joint venture. And a project manager for that particular company must also be the project manager for the for the project under the joint venture must also be an employee of the hub zone. Now, furthermore, there's an exemption to that. For example, that manager doesn't have to be employed by the hub zone at that point, but the time they make the offer, they have to have a letter of commitment, so to speak. So the rules can get kind of complex. So just bear in mind that you can get a lot of these rules by going to the SBA website, or at the very least going into the Federal Acquisition Regulations and looking it up. and they can give you a good deal. Or you can always feel free to contact us here um, at the Wyoming PTAC. We'll be happy to go over any of these rules and processes with you to the best of our ability. And also feel free to contact the Cheyenne Chamber, and they can put you in touch with us, and we can be happy to do that as well. So looks like I've got about 1 minute left here before the coach turns back into a pumpkin. So metaphorically speaking. So basically, there's a lot of benefits. Just in summary, there's a ton of benefits for doing joint ventures and teaming arrangements. It can be complex, but please don't let that deter you from actually going forward and doing it. Help is available out there. We'll be happy to help you with the PTAC. There are a number of law firms that specialize in this, and for a fee, of course, they can help you and set you up with this. So anyway, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. We're going to have a full-length webinar on this, which I'm going to try to get a law firm that specializes in this to present that, and that will be in the spring. You can check for the schedule of those with the Cheyenne Chamber. They have a list of all those along with their tentative dates. And and then I have some closing remarks. I do notice one question up here on the screen I want to ask real quickly. If creating a joint venture, how much lead time would need to get everything in order? You're going to need quite a bit of time. It really depends. I mean, if you just want to set up, the actual setting up of the joint venture is actually pretty easy. Now, getting it qualified under the socioeconomic program rules, that can take a little while, especially if you have to get it certified as one of them in particular. So it could take up to a few weeks. Generally speaking, people set up the joint ventures ahead of time before they bid on a project. It's possible to set it up while you're bidding, but I wouldn't recommend it. So just give yourself a few weeks to do it. The actual forming of the joint venture could only take a day or two, but to get it set right with the socioeconomic programs, that can take a few weeks. So so anyway, so just real quickly, closing remarks. That covers the basics, and I mean the very basics of all this stuff. I just want to say thank you for joining me today for this 22 at noon live session on teaming arrangements and joint ventures. This 22-minute Facebook Live presentation was sponsored by the Greater Cheyenne Chamber of Commerce and the Wyoming PTAC. More sessions are to come, and be sure to stay connected with the Cheyenne Chamber and know when. And also, you can access this video later online at their website. It's Cheyenne Chamber, all one word, no dots or anything, .org, O-R-G. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next time. So thanks, and enjoy the rest of your lunch and the rest of your day.